Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest details in ancient history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 323 before Christ, in the city of Babylon, Alexander the Great died. And almost immediately, the most powerful empire in the world developed a problem. Not a small one, a very dead one. Because Alexander had spent years conquering vast territories, defeating the Persian Empire, marching to India, and generally collecting land like it was a hobby he took way too seriously. But he had not done one very important thing. He had not left a clear successor, which meant that within hours of his death, the room was filled with powerful men trying very hard to look calm, while mentally drawing battle plans against each other. His generals, later called the Diadochi, gathered around him and asked the obvious question: who gets the empire? Alexander, according to tradition, replied, "To the strongest," which is not a plan. That is the ancient equivalent of saying, "You guys figure it out," and then leaving the group chat permanently. But before they could start fighting, which they absolutely would, enthusiastically and with swords, there was a more immediate issue sitting right in front of them: Alexander's body. Because in the ancient world, a king's corpse was not just a corpse. It was a political asset, a symbol, a very expensive piece of influence that unfortunately could not be locked in a safe. Whoever controlled Alexander in death could claim a connection to him in life, and that connection could be turned into legitimacy, and legitimacy could be turned into armies. So now, instead of one problem, they had two. No clear ruler, and one extremely important body that everyone suddenly cared about way more than they probably expected. Burying him immediately would have solved the physical problem, but it would have created a political one, because once he was buried, he was fixed in one place, and whoever controlled that place would instantly gain a massive advantage, which meant nobody wanted to rush that decision. So the generals hesitated. They needed time to argue, time to scheme, time to pretend they weren't about to betray each other. And unfortunately, time is not something a dead body handles particularly well. This is where things become practical. They needed a way to keep Alexander intact, recognizable, presentable, preferably not alarming, because transporting the most famous man in the world is already complicated. Transporting him while he is actively decomposing is even worse. So the question became very simple. How do you preserve the most important corpse in the world, long enough to decide what to do with it? And somewhere in that discussion, someone had an idea. A strange one, a slightly unsettling one, but also a very effective one. Honey. Because when your empire is falling apart, you start with preservation, literally. Now that the generals had accepted one uncomfortable reality, that they needed to keep Alexander, well, intact, the second problem became impossible to ignore. Where was he actually going? Because Alexander wasn't just going to be buried anywhere. There were expectations. Tradition said he should be buried in Macedon, the homeland he had left years earlier, the land of his ancestors, the place where kings of his dynasty were laid to rest. Very respectable, very appropriate, also extremely far away. Babylon to Macedon is not a short journey. It's not even a medium journey. It's thousands of kilometers across rivers, mountains, deserts, and regions that were currently trying to decide whether they were still part of the empire, which is not ideal travel conditions, even for someone alive. And Alexander, at this point, was contributing very little to the logistics. This meant one thing: the funeral procession was going to take months, not days, not weeks, months. And during that time, the body had to survive the journey, because arriving with a well-preserved king sends a very different message than arriving with a situation. And remember, this wasn't just a funeral. It was a political event, a moving symbol of power. Every city the procession passed through would see it. Every soldier would hear about it. Every rival general would be watching closely, which meant the body needed to look like Alexander. Recognizable, dignified, preferably not melting under the Babylonian sun. So now the generals were dealing with a very specific challenge. They needed to transport the most famous man in the world across an unstable empire in the middle of a power struggle, while keeping him visually acceptable the entire time. No pressure. This is where the idea of preservation became less theoretical and more urgent, because without it, the journey simply wasn't possible. Time was no longer just a political advantage. It was a biological problem. The longer they waited, the worse things would get. And since rushing wasn't an option, they needed something that could slow everything down. Something reliable. Something available. Something that didn't require modern technology. Because they did not have that. Which is when someone looked at a very ordinary substance and had a very unusual thought. Honey. Because if you can't shorten the journey, you extend the condition of the traveller, even if the traveller is no longer particularly involved in the decision. At first glance, preserving one of history's greatest conquerors in honey sounds like something someone suggested as a joke, and then nobody stopped them. But here's the surprising part. It actually made sense. A lot of sense. Because honey is not just food. It is one of the most effective natural preservatives available. Something ancient people understood long before modern chemistry came along to explain it. Honey has very low moisture content, which means bacteria struggle to survive in it. It is also naturally acidic, creating an environment where the microbes responsible for decay simply do not thrive. In simple terms, honey is extremely bad for anything trying to decompose, which is exactly what you want when dealing with a body that needs to remain presentable for months. Ancient civilizations had already figured this out. Honey had been used to preserve fruits, meats, and even small animals. In some cases, it could keep organic material intact for surprisingly long periods of time. So when the generals needed a solution, honey wasn't as random as it sounds. It was practical, accessible, and most importantly, effective. Now, to be clear, this was likely not the only method used. Alexander's body was probably treated with additional preservation techniques, possibly involving oils, herbs, or early forms of embalming influenced by Egyptian practices. Because if you're preserving the most important person in the world, you don't rely on just one idea. You combine ideas, you overdo it slightly, you make absolutely sure nothing goes wrong. But honey would have played a key role. It would have slowed decay, reduced odour, and helped maintain the body's appearance long enough for transport. Which brings us to the slightly strange image that history leaves us with. Somewhere in Babylon, preparations are underway. A massive empire is on the verge of civil war. Powerful generals are quietly planning their next moves. And in the middle of all this, Alexander the Great is being placed into a container filled with honey. Not as a symbol, not as a ritual, but as a solution. Because sometimes the most important decisions in history are not dramatic. They are practical, and occasionally a little sticky. Now here's the slightly frustrating part. We do not have a detailed ancient manual titled How to Preserve the Greatest Conqueror in Honey Without Making It Awkward. History, unfortunately, skipped that document. What we do have are scattered references from ancient writers suggesting that Alexander's body was treated and preserved, likely using a combination of techniques, one of which involved honey. So we're left to reconstruct the process using logic, context, and a bit of educated guesswork, which is always fun. First, the body would have been cleaned. This wasn't just about respect, it was about slowing decay. Removing fluids, washing the body, and preparing it for preservation would have been essential. Next, oils and possibly herbs were applied. Ancient cultures used aromatic oils not just for ritual purposes, but because they helped reduce odour and slow the breakdown of tissue. Think of it as early-stage preservation, with a strong emphasis on please don't let this go wrong. Then comes the honey. The body was likely placed in a container, possibly a sarcophagus or sealed vessel, and submerged or surrounded with honey. Not gently drizzled, not artistically arranged, fully immersed. Which is a sentence nobody expected to hear about Alexander the Great. The goal was simple: seal the body in an environment where decay could not progress easily. And honey did exactly that. It reduced exposure to air, limited bacterial growth, and essentially created a protective barrier around the body. Was it perfect? No. Was it effective enough for a long journey? Yes. And that's all they needed. Because remember, this was not about preserving Alexander forever. It was about buying time. Time to transport him. Time to decide where he would be buried. Time for his generals to figure out who was about to start a war with whom. And in the middle of all this, there is something oddly human about the situation. The most powerful man in the world, reduced to a logistical problem that needed solving. No grand philosophy. No divine intervention. Just a group of men standing around asking, how do we keep this from becoming a disaster? And someone answering, honey. Which, to be fair, was probably the best answer available at the time, even if it sounds like the beginning of a very strange recipe. At this point, it would be easy to think the honey was purely practical, a clever, slightly sticky solution to a very real problem. And yes, that was the main reason. But in the ancient world, almost nothing stopped at practicality. Everything meant something, especially when it involved a figure like Alexander the Great. Because Alexander was not just a king, he was a legend in real time, a man who had been compared to gods while still alive, a ruler who visited the oracle at Siwa and came back with a reputation that leaned suspiciously close to divine. So when he died, preserving his body wasn't just about keeping it intact, it was about preserving the image, and honey, oddly enough, fit that image very well. In many ancient cultures, honey was associated with purity, longevity, and even immortality. It didn't rot, it didn't spoil, it lasted, which made it a perfect metaphor. Place Alexander in honey, and you are not just slowing decay. You are making a statement. You are saying, this man does not fade like others. Subtle, but powerful, because symbolism mattered in politics. A lot. The generals who were about to divide Alexander's empire were not just fighting over land. They were fighting over legacy, and legacy is easier to control when it looks intact. Imagine the difference. A preserved, almost lifelike body of Alexander arriving in a city, versus something far less presentable. One reinforces authority, the other raises uncomfortable questions. So the honey served two purposes at once. It kept the body from decaying too quickly, and it kept the story from falling apart. Because as long as Alexander looked like Alexander, the illusion held. The illusion that he still mattered, that his presence still carried weight, that his empire still had a centre, even if that centre was no longer breathing. And there's something slightly ironic about it. The man who conquered half the known world now needed to be preserved like something fragile, carefully handled, protected, maintained. Because for all his power in life, in death, he became something else entirely. A symbol. And symbols, unlike people, have to be managed very carefully, preferably in something that does not spoil, which, once again, brings us back to honey. History is strange like that. Sometimes the difference between chaos and control is a jar. Once Alexander's body had been preserved, the next step was simple in theory. Move him. In reality, it was anything but simple, because this wasn't just a body being transported. This was Alexander the Great, conqueror of empires, destroyer of dynasties, and now, unexpectedly, the centerpiece of the most politically sensitive road trip in history. You don't just throw that into a cart and hope for the best. So the generals did what they always did when faced with a problem. They made it bigger. The funeral carriage designed to carry Alexander's body was described by ancient sources as enormous and highly elaborate. This was not a quiet procession. This was a moving spectacle, a statement, a rolling reminder that even in death, Alexander remained the most important figure in the world. The carriage itself was said to be decorated with gold, columns, statues, and intricate designs. It likely resembled a small temple on wheels more than anything practical, which, from a logistical standpoint, is not ideal. Because when you're travelling thousands of kilometres across uneven terrain, what you really want is something light, efficient, and easy to manoeuvre. Instead, they built something that probably required a team meeting every time it hit a bump. But practicality was not the priority. Visibility was. Every city the procession passed through would see it. Every soldier would talk about it. Every rival would notice. This was propaganda on wheels. And at the centre of it all, preserved carefully, was Alexander. Still recognisable. Still presentable. Still politically useful. The journey itself was slow. Deliberately so. Partly because of the terrain, partly because of the size of the procession, and partly because no one involved was in a hurry to reach the final destination. Because once Alexander was buried, the game changed. Control would become fixed, opportunities would close, and for ambitious men, uncertainty is often more useful than resolution. So the procession moved forward, gradually, across rivers, through plains, past cities that had once seen Alexander alive, and now saw him carried in silence. And all the while the body remained intact. Thanks, in no small part, to the unusual decision made back in Babylon, which meant that for months, as the empire quietly shifted and tensions grew, Alexander continued his journey, not as a conqueror, but as cargo, extremely valuable cargo, preserved, protected, and moving slowly through a world he had once ruled. Which is not how he probably imagined his final campaign would go. While Alexander was travelling, slowly, carefully, and slightly sweetened, something else was happening. The empire he built was beginning to fall apart. Not dramatically at first, more like controlled disagreement, which is a polite way of saying powerful men were starting to prepare for war. Because without Alexander the Great alive to hold everything together, there was no central authority strong enough to keep order across such a vast territory, and Alexander's final plan, if we can generously call it that, had not helped. To the strongest. That line echoed through every conversation, every meeting, every quiet moment where a general looked at another general and thought, I could take him. The Diadochi, Alexander's top commanders, began dividing responsibilities, territories, and influence. Officially, they were cooperating. Unofficially, they were measuring each other. Carefully, suspiciously, constantly. Because everyone knew what was coming. The empire was too large, too diverse, too recently conquered. Without a single powerful ruler, it would not stay united for long. And this is where Alexander's body became even more important. Because in a world without a clear king, symbols matter more than ever. Whoever controlled Alexander could claim to act in his name, and acting in his name could justify almost anything. Armies could be raised, decisions could be enforced, enemies could be labelled as traitors to his legacy. Which meant the funeral procession wasn't just a journey. It was a moving source of legitimacy. A very slow-moving, heavily guarded, honey-preserved argument for power, and everyone was watching it, not just respectfully, strategically, because where Alexander ended up would shape what came next, and the longer the journey lasted, the more time the generals had to prepare, to build alliances, to quietly gather strength, to decide which side of history they wanted to be on. So while the carriage rolled forward across the empire, decorated and dignified, the political ground beneath it was shifting, cracking, splitting into pieces. And soon, those pieces would turn into full-scale wars. Because when one man builds an empire that depends entirely on him, the moment he disappears, everything else starts to come apart, and no amount of honey can can preserve that. At some point during this very slow, very expensive funeral journey, one man looked at the situation and thought, I could improve this. That man was Ptolemy Soter, or, as we'll call him properly, Ptolemy I. He had been one of Alexander's trusted generals, competent, ambitious, and most importantly, very aware of how power worked. And he understood something the others also knew, but hadn't acted on yet. Alexander's body was not just a body, it was legitimacy. And legitimacy, in a collapsing empire, is worth more than gold. Originally, the plan had been to send Alexander back to Macedon for burial. Very traditional, very respectful. Also, not particularly useful for someone trying to build their own power base in Egypt. Which is where Ptolemy I came in. Instead of letting the funeral procession continue its long journey north, he intercepted it. Because why follow the plan when you can simply redirect history? Somewhere along the route, Ptolemy took control of the procession and diverted Alexander's body to Egypt. No subtlety, no hesitation. Just a very clear message. This is mine now. And surprisingly, it worked. Because in that moment, no one was strong enough to stop him. The other generals were busy managing their own territories, building alliances, and preparing for the inevitable conflicts ahead. And Ptolemy had just secured the most powerful symbol in the entire empire. He brought Alexander to Egypt, a land already rich, stable, and strategically important. And now, it had something even more valuable. It had Alexander, which immediately elevated Ptolemy's position. Because ruling Egypt was one thing. Ruling Egypt while holding the body of Alexander the Great? That was something else entirely. It gave him prestige, authority, a direct connection to the most legendary figure of the age, and all of that translated into power. Meanwhile, the rest of the generals were left with a slightly awkward realization. They had spent all this time arguing over land, and Ptolemy had quietly taken the most important piece on the board, without a battle, without a war, just by making a decision at the right time, which in ancient politics is often more effective than an army. And so Alexander's journey changed direction, not toward Macedon, but toward Egypt. Because sometimes history doesn't follow the plan. It follows the person bold enough to ignore it. When Ptolemy I brought Alexander the Great into Egypt, he wasn't just completing a detour, he was making a statement. A very clear one. Egypt, already one of the richest and most stable regions of the former empire, had just gained something no other territory possessed. Alexander himself, or at least the preserved version, which, politically speaking, was more than enough. At first, the body was likely taken to Memphis, one of the traditional centers of power in Egypt. This was a smart move. Memphis carried religious and historical weight, and placing Alexander there immediately connected him to the long line of Egyptian rulers. Because in Egypt, kings weren't just kings, they were divine, pharaohs, living gods, and now Alexander, already rumoured in his lifetime to be the son of Zeus Ammon, could seamlessly fit into that tradition, even in death, which was incredibly convenient. For Ptolemy, this was more than a burial, it was branding. By placing Alexander in Egypt, he wasn't just honouring his former king, he was aligning himself with him, standing beside him, claiming, without saying it directly, I am the one who carries this legacy forward. And the presence of the body made that claim feel real. People could see it, visit it, stand in front of it. This wasn't an abstract idea of succession. It was physical, visible, almost tangible, which made it powerful. Later, the body would be moved to Alexandria, the great city Alexander himself had founded. A city designed to represent Greek power in Egypt, blending cultures, ideas, and influence. And now, it would also house Alexander, which turned Alexandria into something more than just a city. It became a centre of memory, a place where the past and present met, where rulers could connect themselves to the greatest conqueror of their age. and people came to see it, not just locals, travellers, officials, eventually even Roman leaders, because standing before Alexander, even preserved, even silent, meant something. It reminded everyone of what had been achieved, and what power could look like. And for Ptolemy I, that was the entire point, because ruling Egypt was good. But ruling Egypt while hosting the body of Alexander the Great, that was better. Much better. And all of it started with a simple decision. Take the body, keep the legend, and let the rest of the world catch up. Once Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy I, had secured Alexander, the next step was obvious. You don't just keep the most famous man in the world in storage, you display him, carefully, strategically, with just enough grandeur to remind everyone exactly who they were looking at. Eventually, Alexander's body was moved to Alexandria, the city he had founded, which at this point was becoming one of the most important centres of culture, trade and power in the Mediterranean. And now it had something no other city could offer. It had Alexander. A tomb was constructed to house him, often referred to by later writers as the Soma, a resting place that was anything but ordinary, because this wasn't just a burial site, it was a destination. People came to see it, and not just curious locals, rulers, generals, foreign visitors. Later, even Roman emperors would make the journey to stand before the preserved body of Alexander the Great, which is a very long trip, just to look at someone who was no longer particularly interactive. But that's the point. Alexander still mattered. Even in death, he had presence, power, reputation. Standing in front of his tomb wasn't just about respect, it was about association. If you were powerful, you visited Alexander. If you were ambitious, you compared yourself to him. If you were trying to impress people, you made sure everyone knew you had seen him. Because proximity to greatness has always been useful, even when that greatness is no longer moving. The tomb itself likely reflected this importance. While exact details are debated, it was probably richly decorated, centrally located, and designed to be seen. This was not a hidden grave. This was a public symbol, a carefully maintained reminder of the man who had once ruled the known world, and at the centre of it all, the body remained, preserved, recognisable, still doing its job, because that's what it had become. Not a person, not even just a memory, but a tool, a very effective one. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Alexander had conquered cities, nations, and empires. But in the end, his greatest influence might have come from simply lying still, preserved in honey, displayed in a tomb, and continuing to shape history without saying a word. Which is not how most people plan their legacy. But then again, most people don't end up like Alexander. By the time Alexander the Great was resting in Alexandria, something unusual had happened. He had stopped being a person and started being an advantage. Because in the unstable world that followed his death, power wasn't just about armies or territory, it was about legitimacy. And legitimacy is a fragile thing. You can claim it, you can announce it, you can even shout it very confidently. But it helps a lot if you can point to something and say, "See, this proves it." For Ptolemy I, that something was Alexander himself, or more specifically, his body. Because as long as Alexander remained in Egypt, Ptolemy I could position himself not just as a ruler, but as a successor, a guardian of Alexander's legacy, the man who had taken care of him, even in death, which in ancient politics was a very persuasive argument. It suggested loyalty, continuity, stability, all the things people tend to like in a ruler, especially after an empire has just collapsed into a series of very tense disagreements. And Ptolemy I used that advantage well. He didn't need to constantly explain why he deserved power. The answer was right there, visible, preserved, impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, other generals had to rely on different methods. Military strength, alliances, carefully worded claims, which are all effective, but none of them come with a physical symbol you can put in a city and invite people to visit. Alexander, on the other hand, required no explanation. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what he had done. And now, anyone in Alexandria could see him, which made the connection feel real. And real is powerful, even if it's slightly unsettling, because there is something strange about it. A man who had spent his life moving, conquering, expanding, now reduced to staying in one place, serving a purpose he never chose, helping shape a political system he would probably have found frustrating. But that's what happens in history. People become symbols, symbols become tools, and tools get used. And in this case, the tool just happened to be one of the most famous individuals to ever live, carefully preserved, strategically displayed, and still influencing the world, without doing anything at all. For a man who had spent his life constantly moving, Alexander the Great had a surprisingly active afterlife. Not in a mystical sense, more in a administrative inconvenience kind of way, because even after being placed in Alexandria, his body didn't just settle quietly into history, it kept being moved, adjusted, handled, which is not usually what you expect from a final resting place. At some point, the tomb was modified, possibly relocated within the city, and later accounts suggest that the body itself may have been transferred into a more visible container, sometimes described as glass or crystal, because apparently being preserved in honey was only the beginning. Now the goal was visibility, clarity, presentation, which makes sense. If your entire political advantage is based on people seeing Alexander, then you want them to actually see Alexander, not guess, not assume, see. And they did. Ancient sources describe visitors coming to view the body directly, not just the tomb, the body itself, which raises a slightly uncomfortable realization. For years, possibly centuries, people could walk into a chamber in Alexandria and look at the preserved remains of one of the most famous men in history, up close. This wasn't distant reverence, this was visual confirmation, and that made it powerful, because it removed doubt. Alexander wasn't just a story, he was there, still present, still recognizable, still part of the world, and rulers took advantage of this. Later figures, including powerful leaders from outside Egypt, made visits to the tomb, not just out of curiosity, but out of ambition. Standing before Alexander was a statement, a way of saying, I stand where he stood. I follow in his path. I belong in this story. Even if realistically they were just standing in a room, looking at a very old, very well-preserved body. But perception matters, and perception in this case was carefully managed, maintained, adjusted over time. Because the longer Alexander remained visible, the longer his influence could be used, even as the world around him changed, even as new empires rose, even as his own empire had long since fractured into pieces. And there's something oddly fitting about it. A man who refused to stay still in life, still refusing, in a way, to stay still in death. Moved, displayed, reused, reinterpreted. Because when you become a legend, even your resting place becomes negotiable. At this point, there is a very reasonable question sitting quietly in the background. Did the honey actually work? Or was this just a very confident ancient experiment that somehow didn't go completely wrong? The answer is surprisingly reassuring. Yes, it likely worked. Not perfectly, not forever, but well enough for what they needed. Because the goal was never to preserve Alexander the Great for eternity. This wasn't about creating an immortal body. This was about buying time, and honey was very good at that. As we mentioned earlier, honey has natural antibacterial properties. It has low water content, which makes it difficult for microorganisms to survive. It creates an environment where decay slows down significantly. In some cases, organic material placed in honey can remain preserved for long periods. Not fresh exactly, but stable. Which, in this situation, was more than enough. Now, to be clear, Honey was probably not acting alone. Alexander's body was likely treated with additional preservation techniques, possibly oils, resins, and methods influenced by Egyptian embalming practices once he reached that region. Because by the time he arrived in Egypt, the standards for preserving important bodies were quite high. The Egyptians had been doing this for centuries, very successfully. So what we're really looking at is a combination of methods: honey for transport, additional treatments for longer-term preservation, a layered approach, which sounds much more sophisticated than just pour honey on it and hope for the best, even if that's how it sounds at first. And based on historical accounts, it worked well enough that Alexander's body remained visible and recognizable for a long time. Visitors could see him. Rulers could identify him. The illusion held, which was the entire point. Because again, this wasn't about biology. It was about politics. As long as Alexander looked like Alexander, his presence could still be used. His legacy could still be controlled. His story could still be shaped. And honey helped make that possible. Which is a strange but important detail, because out of all the tools used to preserve one of history's greatest figures, one of the most effective was something you might casually put on bread. History has a way of doing that, taking something ordinary and quietly giving it a very important job. At first glance, the idea of preserving Alexander the Great in honey sounds ridiculous, almost like a misunderstanding, or a story that got slightly out of control over time. Because when you think of kings, you think of gold, marble, elaborate rituals, not something you could theoretically find in a kitchen. And yet, the more you look at it, the more it starts to feel less like a strange decision, and more like a very clever one, because the people dealing with this situation weren't trying to be poetic. They were trying to solve a problem, a very urgent, very practical problem. They needed to preserve a body for months, in heat, across long distances, without modern tools, and they needed it to remain presentable, which eliminates most options immediately. You can't rush the journey, you can't ignore the decay, and you definitely can't afford a mistake, because the consequences weren't just unpleasant, they were political. If Alexander's body deteriorated beyond recognition, it would weaken the illusion. The symbol would break, and with it, a significant source of authority. So the solution had to be reliable, accessible, and effective. Honey checked all those boxes. It didn't require special equipment. It was widely available, and it had already proven its ability to preserve organic material, which made it, in a way, one of the most advanced solutions available at the time, not because it was sophisticated, but because it worked. And that's often the difference between a strange idea and a good one. Results. And the results speak for themselves. Alexander's body made the journey. It arrived intact. It remained visible for years afterward. It continued to influence politics long after his death. All of which suggests that the people who made this decision knew exactly what they were doing, even if the method sounds unusual to us now. And there's something quietly impressive about that. No grand invention, no lost ancient technology, just a simple substance, used in the right way at the right time, because history isn't always shaped by the most complex ideas. Sometimes it's shaped by the most effective ones, even if they happen to be slightly sticky. In the end, Alexander the Great did something very few people managed to do. He kept shaping the world after he was gone. Not through words, not through decisions, but through presence, a preserved presence. Because long after his death, his body continued to influence politics, power, and perception across the ancient world. Generals fought over his legacy. Rulers aligned themselves with his memory. Cities built identity around his name. And for a time, his body, carefully preserved, transported, and displayed, sat at the centre of it all. A silent authority, a still point in a very unstable world. And yet, like many things in history, that presence did not last forever. Over time, the exact location of Alexander's tomb was lost. Somewhere in Alexandria, one of the most famous cities of the ancient world, the final resting place of one of the most famous men simply disappeared. No clear records, no confirmed rediscovery, just theories, which is strangely fitting. A man who moved constantly in life, eventually becoming impossible to find in death. And there's a certain irony in that. After all the effort to preserve him, all the planning, all the careful decisions, including the slightly unexpected use of honey, his body, which once held so much political weight, faded from the world. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually, quietly, until it became another mystery. And maybe that's the final lesson here. Power fades, empires fracture. Even the most carefully preserved legacies eventually slip out of reach. But for a moment, a long, influential moment, Alexander remained. Visible, relevant, important. All because a group of people looked at a difficult problem and found a solution that worked. Not perfectly, not forever, but long enough to change history. Which, in the end, is often all it takes. And if that solution happened to involve honey, well, history has definitely done stranger things. Somewhere within the shadowed fortresses of 17th century France, a man lived in silence, his identity buried deeper than the stone walls that confined him. Guards brought him food, spoke to him cautiously, even showed him a strange level of respect, yet none of them were allowed to look directly at his face, because wherever he went, he wore a mask. Not a theatrical mask, not something chosen, something enforced. This prisoner would later become known as the Man in the Iron Mask, a name that sounds almost mythical, like something invented to frighten children or entertain bored nobles. But he was real, painfully real. And the strangest part is this. He wasn't treated like a common criminal. No chains dragging behind him, no public trial, no record of a crime. Instead, he was hidden, carefully, deliberately, as if his very existence was dangerous. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What kind of man needs to be erased, but also protected? Because he wasn't simply locked away. He was moved between prisons under strict supervision, always accompanied by a trusted officer, always kept under close watch. Orders were clear. No one was to hear his story, no one was to speak to him freely, and under no circumstances was anyone to see his face. If he ever removed the mask in front of others, the consequences would be severe. You can imagine how seriously that rule was taken. And yet, despite all this secrecy, whispers began to spread. Who was he? Some said he was a disgraced noble who knew too much. Others believed he had betrayed the crown in some unforgivable way. But the most dangerous rumour, the one that refused to die, was far more unsettling. What if he wasn't just a man, but someone connected to the royal bloodline itself? Because in a court full of power, ambition, and carefully crafted appearances, identity was everything. And if this prisoner shared a face with someone important, someone untouchable, then hiding him behind a mask wasn't just punishment. It was necessity. And so, while France glittered under the rule of kings and courtiers, one man sat in the dark, his name erased, his face concealed, his story locked away with him. Not forgotten, hidden, and perhaps hidden for a reason far more dangerous than anyone dared to admit. If the mask itself wasn't enough to raise suspicion, the way this prisoner was treated certainly was. Because everything about his captivity suggested one thing. He was important. Dangerously important. He wasn't thrown into a filthy dungeon and left to rot like most prisoners of 17th century France. Instead, he was kept under constant supervision by a single man, Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, a loyal officer of Louis XIV. Saint-Mars didn't just guard him, he followed him, from one prison to another. First at Pignerol, then at Exiles, then Sainte-Marguerite, and finally the Bastille. Wherever St. Mars was appointed, the masked prisoner went too. Now think about that. In a time when prisoners were disposable, when most died unnamed and unmourned, this man was moved carefully, deliberately, like a secret too dangerous to leave behind. And St. Mars had strict instructions, orders so precise they bordered on obsession. The prisoner was to be isolated. No one was to speak to him unnecessarily. No one was to see his face. And most chilling of all, if he ever removed his mask in front of others, he was to be killed immediately, not punished. Killed. That alone tells you everything. Because you don't issue that kind of order for a thief or a political nuisance or even a traitor. You issue it for someone whose identity could shatter something fragile, something powerful. And yet, despite these extreme measures, there are records that suggest the prisoner lived relatively comfortably. He was given clean clothes, decent food, even furniture. At times, he was allowed books. This wasn't cruelty. This was containment, like a dangerous truth wrapped in silk. Other prisoners reportedly noticed the difference. They whispered. They speculated. Who was this man who lived better than they did, yet was denied the most basic human freedom, to be seen? Some believed he was a noble who had fallen from grace. Others thought he knew secrets about the royal court. And a few more daring voices suggested something unthinkable. What if he wasn't just connected to the king? What if he was the king? Or at least, someone who should have been. Because the deeper you look into this story, the more one possibility begins to emerge from the shadows. Not a servant, not a spy, but someone born into power, erased from history. And if that's true, then the mask wasn't meant to hide him from the world. It was meant to hide the world from him. By the time whispers about the masked prisoner reached the wider world, one theory began to dominate all others. Dangerous, seductive, and almost impossible to prove. What if the man behind the mask was not just important, but identical to the king himself? At the centre of this theory stands Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruler of France, the embodiment of absolute power. A man who carefully crafted his image as unique, divine, and untouchable. His face was not just a face, it was authority itself. Now imagine, just for a moment, that there existed another man with that same face. Not a distant cousin, not a look-alike, a twin. It sounds like something out of a dramatic play, and in fact, it later inspired writers and storytellers for exactly that reason. But in the rigid, carefully controlled world of the French monarchy, even the possibility of a twin posed a terrifying risk. Because if two men shared the same royal face, then which one was truly king? And more importantly, could the wrong one take the throne? 17th century France was built on the illusion of singular power. The king was chosen by God, unique in his authority. A duplicate would not just confuse that idea, it would destroy it. Civil unrest, political chaos, rival factions, all could erupt from a single dangerous truth. So, what would you do if you were the king? If such a twin existed, there were only two options: eliminate him or erase him. And perhaps, just perhaps, the mask was the chosen solution. Not a punishment, but a precaution. Because killing a royal, even a hidden one, could create its own problems. But hiding him, silencing him, keeping him alive yet invisible, that was far cleaner, far safer, and it would explain everything: the secrecy, the careful treatment, the constant transfers under trusted supervision. This wasn't about locking away a criminal. This was about containing a possibility, a rival who could never be allowed to exist in the eyes of the world. Of course, there is no official record confirming this theory. No document openly admits that Louis XIV had a twin hidden away in silence. But then again, would such a document ever be allowed to survive? Because if the truth really was that dangerous, it wouldn't be written down. It would be buried, just like the man behind the mask. And as the years passed, the mystery only deepened, drawing in philosophers, writers, and skeptics alike. each trying to peel back the layers of a secret that refused to die. If the masked prisoner was the secret, then the man guarding him was the lock. His name was Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, and without him, this mystery might have faded into obscurity centuries ago. Because Saint-Mars didn't just oversee prisons, he oversaw this man, closely, consistently, almost obsessively. Wherever Saint-Mars went, the prisoner followed, from the fortress of Pignerol to the remote exiles, then to the island prison of Sainte Marguerite, and finally to the infamous Bastille. Different locations, same arrangement, the masked man, and the one man trusted to keep him hidden. That level of continuity was not normal. Prison governors didn't usually drag inmates across France like personal luggage, especially not one prisoner, especially not one whose identity was supposedly irrelevant. Which raises a far more interesting question. Why Saint-Mars? Because he wasn't just any officer. He was loyal, quiet, discreet, the kind of man who followed orders without asking dangerous questions. And more importantly, the kind of man who understood that some truths were not meant to be spoken, even in whispers. There are surviving letters written by Saint-Mars, carefully worded, almost sterile in tone, but even within them you can feel the tension. He refers to the prisoner with vague descriptions, never a name, always the man or my prisoner, never anything that might anchor him to a real identity, as if even writing it down would be a risk. And yet, small details slipped through. The prisoner required special treatment. His meals had to be delivered privately. Furniture was inspected. Even the walls of his cell were checked. No scratches, no messages, no signs that he might be communicating with anyone outside. It wasn't just imprisonment. It was containment of information. Because here's the unsettling part. Saint-Mars wasn't just guarding a man. He was guarding a secret so fragile that even a single loose word could unravel it. And for decades he succeeded. No escapes, no confirmed identity, just silence. But silence, as it turns out, has a way of attracting attention. The more carefully something is hidden, the more people begin to wonder why. And over time, rumours grew louder, not quieter, because if one man had dedicated his entire career to watching over a single prisoner, then that prisoner had to be more than just dangerous. He had to be inconvenient to the truth. And the longer Saint-Mars kept that truth buried, the more irresistible it became. Because secrets like this don't disappear. They wait, and eventually, they begin to leak. For years, the masked prisoner remained a ghost, seen, guarded, but never truly known. Yet no secret, no matter how carefully buried, can stay perfectly contained. Not in a world filled with curious minds, idle guards, and restless prisoners. Because prisons, for all their stone and iron, are terrible at keeping silence. At first, the rumours were small. A servant noticing that one prisoner received better food. A guard mentioning, perhaps too casually, that a man inside was never allowed to show his face. A passing comment here, a half-heard conversation there, nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough to spark curiosity. And curiosity, as always, spread faster than truth. At the island prison of Sainte Marguerite, whispers began to circulate among those who worked there. They spoke of a man who wore a mask, even when eating, lifting it only slightly, carefully, as if even the act of breathing required secrecy. Some claimed his voice was refined, educated, nothing like a common criminal. Others insisted he carried himself with a strange dignity, even in captivity. Not broken, not desperate, just contained. And that detail alone was enough to transform rumour into legend. Because prisoners were supposed to beg, rage, or decay. They weren't supposed to sit quietly, as if they understood exactly why they were there. Soon, stories grew bolder. Some said the man had once been a noble, disgraced for knowing too much about the inner workings of the court. Others claimed he had been involved in secret political schemes, the kind that never reached public record. There were even whispers that he had been close too close to power itself. But the most persistent rumours always circled back to the same dangerous idea, that he was not just connected to royalty, but part of it. And once that idea took hold, it refused to disappear. Because the French court of the 17th century was a place of masks itself, not of iron, but of smiles, titles, and carefully constructed appearances. Beneath the surface, alliances shifted, betrayals brewed, and secrets were currency. In such a world, hiding a man behind a literal mask didn't seem so impossible anymore. In fact, it felt almost fitting. And while the prisoner remained locked away, the story of his existence began to escape, slipping through cracks in discipline carried by gossip, shaped by imagination. Each retelling made it larger, stranger, more irresistible, because people weren't just asking who he was anymore. They were asking why someone would go to such extreme lengths to ensure that no one would ever find out. And once that question takes hold, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because sometimes, the mystery isn't the man behind the mask. It's the fear of what happens if the mask ever comes off. After years of quiet transfers and careful concealment, the masked prisoner reached his final destination, the place that would seal his legend forever. The Bastille. Not just a prison, but a symbol. A fortress looming over Paris, where those who threatened the state, politically, personally, or inconveniently, were sent to disappear. And in 1698, when Bening d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars was appointed governor of the Bastille, he brought his most guarded secret with him. The masked man arrived shortly after, and even here, among some of the most closely watched prisoners in France, he stood apart. He was placed in a special cell, not the worst, not the best, but controlled. Everything about his presence was handled with precision. Orders were repeated, reinforced, and obeyed without question. The mask stayed on. Conversations were limited, contact was minimized. Even in a prison designed for secrecy, this man required an extra layer of silence, and that alone tells you something. Because by the time he reached the Bastille, this was no longer just about hiding him. It was about finishing what had started years earlier. Other prisoners noticed, of course. They always did. A man treated differently is impossible to ignore. Guards behaved more cautiously around him. Instructions were stricter. There was an invisible line drawn around his existence, one that no one dared to cross. But still, people tried to understand. Some claimed they saw glimpses of him through partially opened doors, a figure sitting calmly, wearing a dark mask that concealed his face entirely. Not iron, as later legends would claim, but likely velvet or cloth, practical but no less symbolic. Because the material didn't matter. The purpose did. And the purpose was absolute anonymity. No name, no face, no identity, just a presence. And yet, despite this enforced invisibility, the man did not behave like someone erased. Reports suggest he remained composed, even dignified. He followed instructions. He did not resist. He did not attempt escape. Almost as if he understood. Almost as if he knew that whatever truth he carried was never meant to leave those walls. Then, in 1703, after decades of silence, the prisoner died. Quietly, without ceremony, without explanation. He was buried under a false name, and just like that, the man himself vanished completely. But the mystery didn't die with him. Because when a story is built on silence, death doesn't end it. It amplifies it. And now, with no living witness left to confirm the truth, the question only grew louder. Who was he, really? In 1703, the masked prisoner died inside the Bastille. No public announcement, no royal statement, no explanation, just silence. According to the official record, he was buried under the name Marchioli, a name that to this day feels more like a placeholder than a truth. A convenient label to close a file, to tidy away a life that had been deliberately obscured for decades. But here's the problem. Even in death, the secrecy didn't stop. The burial was handled with the same careful control that had defined his imprisonment. Personal belongings were reportedly destroyed. His cell was cleaned thoroughly, scraped, washed, stripped of anything that might preserve a trace of who he had been. As if the goal wasn't just to end his life, but to erase it completely, which, of course, had the opposite effect. Because when you try this hard to hide something, people start asking why, and they didn't stop. The moment word spread that a mysterious masked prisoner had died in the Bastille, curiosity exploded. Writers, thinkers, and observers began to piece together fragments, records, rumours, inconsistencies. And among those drawn into the mystery was Voltaire, one of the sharpest minds of his time. Voltaire didn't just repeat the story, he gave it shape. He wrote about a prisoner forced to wear a mask, treated with unusual respect, hidden from the world for reasons that were never explained. And by doing so, he transformed a guarded secret into a public enigma. From that point on, the man in the iron mask was no longer just a prisoner. He became a question, and questions are far more powerful than facts, because facts can be closed, archived, forgotten. Questions linger, and the more people looked into the story, the more unsettling it became. Why destroy his belongings? Why bury him under a false name? Why maintain secrecy even after his death, when whatever threat he posed should have been gone? Unless, of course, the threat wasn't the man himself, but what he represented. Because if his identity had the power to destabilize something political, something royal, then revealing it, even after his death, could still cause damage. And so, the silence continued. Officially, the story ended in a quiet grave, but in reality, it had only just begun. Because now, with no living witness left, no confession, no face, the mystery was free to grow, to evolve, and to become something far larger than the man it once concealed. With the prisoner gone, and the truth buried alongside him, the mystery of the man in the iron mask did something unexpected. It expanded. Because once a story loses its ending, people begin to write their own. The first theory to take hold, perhaps the most famous, was the idea of a royal twin. The hidden brother of Louis XIV, locked away to protect the illusion of a single divine ruler. It was dramatic, unsettling, and almost too perfect. A secret duplicate, erased from history, forced to live in shadow while his counterpart ruled in sunlight. And people loved it. Not because it was proven, but because it felt right. But it wasn't the only explanation. Another theory pointed toward Ercole Antonio Mattioli, a diplomat who betrayed French interests during delicate political negotiations. He had been imprisoned under secrecy, and his disappearance from records aligned suspiciously with the timeline of the masked prisoner. A traitor, then? Possibly. But would a traitor require a mask for decades? Others suggested the prisoner was a disgraced noble, someone entangled in court scandals too dangerous to expose publicly. Perhaps he knew secrets about the inner workings of power, affairs, betrayals, financial manipulations, the kind of knowledge that could destroy reputations or ignite unrest. And then there were even stranger ideas. Some believed he was an illegitimate relative of the royal family. Others thought he was involved in espionage, a man caught between nations, carrying information too sensitive to be revealed or executed without consequence. Each theory tried to answer the same question. Why the mask? Because imprisonment alone would have been enough to silence most men. Execution would have been quicker. Exile, simpler. But a mask, a permanent concealment of identity, suggested something far more specific. Not just punishment, prevention of recognition. And that detail continues to haunt the mystery, because it implies that if his face had been seen, truly seen, it would have meant something. It would have connected him to someone. It would have confirmed something that could not be allowed to exist. And that's why none of these theories ever fully satisfy. Each one explains part of the story, but never all of it. The twin theory is dramatic, but lacks evidence. The The Mattioli theory is grounded, but lacks the need for such extreme secrecy. The Noble theory is plausible, but vague. And so, the mystery remains suspended, balanced between fact and imagination, history and legend, not solved, not forgotten, just waiting. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that refuse to choose a single truth. Long after the prisoner was buried under a false name, long after the Bastille itself would fall to revolution, the man in the iron mask refused to disappear. In fact, he became something far more powerful than he had ever been in life. A symbol. Because what began as a carefully guarded secret transformed into a story retold across generations, shaped, exaggerated, and immortalized by writers who saw in it something irresistible. Among them was Alexandre Dumas, who took the mystery and turned it into legend. In his telling, the masked prisoner was indeed the twin of Louis XIV, a rightful king hidden away so the wrong one could rule. It was dramatic, emotional, and unforgettable. A tale of stolen identity, betrayal, and quiet suffering behind cold walls. And from that moment on, the mystery was no longer just history. It was myth. But here's the interesting part. Despite all the embellishment, all the storytelling, the core question never went away. Who was he? Even today, historians revisit the evidence. They analyse letters, prison records, royal correspondence. They compare timelines, cross-reference names, and attempt to reconstruct a life that was intentionally erased. And yet, no answer fully satisfies. Because the truth, if it still exists, was never meant to survive. The man himself left behind nothing. No confession, no verified identity, no final words that could unlock the story. Just fragments, and a mask. And that mask, whether made of iron, velvet, or imagination, became the most important part of the entire mystery. Because it represents something deeper than a hidden face. It represents control, the power to define what is seen and what is never allowed to be seen. In the court of 17th century France, appearances were everything. Power depended on perception. And if a single face had the potential to disrupt that fragile balance, then hiding it wasn't just an option. It was a necessity. So the man was concealed, his name erased, his story buried. And yet somehow he endured. Not as a person, but as a question. A question that has outlived kings, prisons, and even the system that created it. Because in the end, the man in the iron mask is not just a mystery about identity. It is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can possess is not power, but a face that should never be seen. Long before coffee became a rushed morning habit, it belonged to the night. In the medieval Middle East, coffee was not something you grabbed on the way to work. It was something you entered into, a slow ritual, a shared moment, a quiet transformation of the senses. And its story begins far from the bustling cities it would later define, in the highlands of Ethiopia, where the first coffee berries were discovered. But discovery is one thing, meaning is another. And it was in Yemen that coffee found its true identity. Because here, in the mountain monasteries and desert lodges of Sufi mystics, coffee became something almost sacred. These were men devoted to long nights of prayer, meditation, and spiritual chanting, hours that demanded focus, endurance, and presence. Sleep was an obstacle, fatigue an enemy. Coffee changed that. The dark, bitter drink allowed them to remain awake, alert, and deeply immersed in their rituals. It sharpened the mind, steadied the body, and, in a way, opened a door between the physical and the spiritual. Some even believed it helped bring them closer to the divine, not by altering reality, but by intensifying awareness. And so, coffee became part of devotion. Prepared carefully, consumed slowly, respected. From these Sufi circles, the drink began to spread, first quietly, then with growing momentum. It moved from secluded religious spaces into the wider communities of Yemeni cities. Traders, scholars, and travellers encountered it, tasted it, and carried its memory with them. And what they carried was not just flavour, it was energy, a different kind of energy than anything people were used to. No intoxication, no loss of control, just clarity, alertness, and a subtle sense of warmth that lingered long after the cup was empty. That alone made it revolutionary, because in a world where wine often blurred the mind, coffee sharpened it. And that difference would change everything. Soon, coffee was no longer confined to spiritual practice. It began appearing in homes, gatherings, and eventually, in spaces designed entirely around it. Places where people would sit, talk, think, argue, and create. Places that did not yet exist, but were about to. Because once a drink begins to reshape how people experience time, especially the night, it stops being just a drink. It becomes a culture. And medieval Arab society was about to build an entire world around it. As coffee spread beyond the quiet circles of Sufi devotion, it began to reshape something even more powerful than ritual. It began to reshape society, because once people discovered that this dark drink could keep the mind sharp and the body awake, they didn't want to experience it alone. Coffee demanded conversation. It invited presence. And slowly, almost naturally, new spaces began to emerge. Spaces built entirely around this shared experience. The first coffee houses appeared in cities like Mecca and Cairo, and they were unlike anything that had come before. They were called kave-khane, houses of coffee. But they were more than that. Inside, the atmosphere was alive. Lamps flickered against stone walls. The scent of roasted beans hung in the air. Men gathered on low cushions, cups in hand, voices rising and falling in waves of discussion. Some played games, others listened to poetry. Some simply sat, observing, thinking, absorbing. Because coffee houses were not places of escape. They were places of engagement. Here, ideas moved freely. Scholars debated philosophy. Merchants discussed trade routes and distant lands. Storytellers recited tales that blurred the line between history and imagination. News travelled faster here than anywhere else. Whispers of politics, rumours of power shifts, fragments of a world constantly in motion. And for many this was the real attraction. Not just the coffee, but the conversation. Because for the first time, there existed a space where people could gather not for religion, not for business alone, not for formal ceremony, but simply to think together. And that was revolutionary. These coffee houses became known as schools of the wise, not because they were formal institutions, but because knowledge lived there. It moved between people, shaped by voices, sharpened by disagreement. And naturally, not everyone was comfortable with that. Because when people gather, think, and speak freely, power begins to feel uneasy. Authorities started to notice. Religious leaders questioned the drink. Political figures watched the gatherings with suspicion. What was being said inside these coffee houses? What ideas were forming? What alliances were quietly taking shape over cups of dark, steaming liquid? Because a space that encourages thought is also a space that can challenge control. And yet, despite the growing tension, coffee houses continued to spread. From city to city, from street to street, becoming louder, richer, more influential with every passing year. Because once people taste a place where their minds can truly wake up, they don't go back to silence. As coffee houses spread across the medieval Arab world, they began to take on a rhythm of their own. Not loud, not chaotic, but alive in a quieter, more deliberate way. Because once the sun set and the streets cooled, these spaces transformed into something almost magical. The flicker of oil lamps, the soft murmur of voices, the slow passing of cups. Everything seemed to move in harmony. And at the centre of it all was not just coffee, but expression. In cities like Baghdad and Damascus, coffee houses became gathering places for poets, thinkers, and listeners. Not performers in the modern sense, but individuals who carried words as carefully as others carried gold. A man would stand, he would clear his throat, and then, slowly, he would begin. Poetry in the medieval Arab world was not casual entertainment. It was layered, symbolic, and deeply emotional. Verses spoke of love, loss, faith, longing, exile, and the quiet struggles of the human soul. And in the glow of the coffee house, these words found their audience. Listeners leaned in, not distracted, not impatient, present, because coffee sharpened the mind, but it also seemed to soften the moment, stretching time just enough for every word to land, to echo, to settle. And when the poem ended, there was often no applause, just silence, the kind of silence that means something has been understood. Then the discussions would begin. Interpretations, disagreements, reflections. One line of poetry could spark an entire evening of conversation. Philosophical ideas were woven into verse, and those ideas, once released into the room, refused to stay still. This is where thought became shared. Not taught, not imposed, but exchanged. And over time, these gatherings became more than cultural habits. They became intellectual ecosystems. Because in these spaces, knowledge was not locked inside books. It moved through voices, shaped by emotion, sharpened by debate. A merchant might challenge a scholar. A poet might question a philosopher. And through that friction, ideas grew stronger, or fell apart. Either way, something was happening, something subtle but powerful. Because when people gather night after night to listen, to speak, to think, something begins to shift, not loudly, but steadily. And in those dimly lit rooms, over cups of dark coffee, a culture of thought was quietly being built, one conversation at a time. As coffee houses grew louder with ideas and fuller with people, something else began to grow alongside them. Suspicion. Because from the outside, these places didn't just look like social gatherings anymore. They looked like something harder to control. Groups of men sitting for hours, talking, debating, exchanging information, sometimes about philosophy, sometimes about trade, and sometimes about power. And that last part made people nervous. In cities like Mecca and Cairo, local authorities began to pay closer attention. What exactly was happening inside these coffee houses? Why were they becoming so popular? And more importantly, what were people saying once they were inside? Because coffee did something unusual. It didn't dull the senses like wine. It sharpened them. People stayed awake longer. Conversations lasted deeper into the night. Ideas were formed, challenged, refined. And in a world where authority depended heavily on control, of behaviour, of information, of public spaces, that kind of environment was unpredictable. Rumours started to spread. Some religious leaders questioned whether coffee was even acceptable. It stimulated the mind, altered behaviour, encouraged late-night gatherings. Was that not, in its own way, a form of intoxication? Others worried less about the drink itself and more about what surrounded it. The conversations. Because in those rooms, people were not just talking about poetry anymore. They were discussing politics, governance, social norms. They were questioning things. Quietly, perhaps, but still questioning. And questioning, in the wrong setting, can become dangerous. So, naturally, attempts were made to control it. At different moments in history, coffee houses were restricted, even temporarily banned. Authorities tried to shut them down, to disperse the gatherings, to return people to more predictable patterns of life. But it didn't work, because by that point, coffee houses were no longer just places. They were habits, rituals, communities. You could close a building, but you couldn't erase the desire that had formed inside it. People would find other spaces, other corners, other ways to gather. Because once the mind becomes used to being awake, truly awake, it resists going back to silence. And that's what made coffee so different. It wasn't just the drink, it was what the drink allowed. Longer nights, sharper thoughts, freer conversations. And for those in power, that combination was unsettling, because control is easiest when people are quiet, tired, and predictable. Coffee made them none of those things, and once that change began, there was no simple way to undo it. As coffee became woven into daily life, it was not treated casually. It was handled with care. Because in the medieval Arab world, preparing coffee was not just about making a drink. It was about honouring a ritual. Every step, from the roasting of the beans to the final pour, carried intention. And in many homes and coffee houses, the process itself was just as important as the result. It often began with the roasting. Green coffee beans were placed over an open flame in shallow pans, stirred slowly until they darkened and released their rich, unmistakable aroma. The scent alone could fill an entire room, signalling that something was about to begin. Then came the grinding, done by hand, using simple tools, producing a fine powder that held all the intensity of the beans within it. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. The coffee was then brewed in vessels like the dalla, a distinctive pot with a curved spout, designed not just for function, but for elegance. Water was heated, the ground coffee added, sometimes accompanied by spices like cardamom, which gave the drink a subtle warmth and complexity. And then it was poured. But even this was done with precision. Coffee was served in small cups, often without handles, filled only part way. Never to the brim, always with control. The host would pour for the guest, not the other way around, and the order mattered. Elders, honoured guests, respected figures were served first. Because coffee was not just about taste. It was about respect and hospitality. Refusing a cup could be seen as impolite. Accepting it meant entering into a shared moment, a quiet agreement of presence. Sometimes the guest would lightly shake the cup when finished, a subtle signal that no more was needed. Words were not always necessary. The ritual spoke for itself. In many ways, these traditions turned coffee into something almost ceremonial. Not rigid, not overly formal, but structured enough to carry meaning. A simple drink became a language of gestures, roles, and unspoken understanding. And this mattered, because in a world where social bonds were essential, where trust was built face to face, rituals like these created stability. They gave people a way to connect without needing explanation. You entered a space, you were offered coffee, you accepted, and just like that, you were part of something. Not just a conversation, but a tradition that had been repeated countless times before you, and would continue long after. Because coffee, in this world, was never just consumed. It was experienced, shared, and remembered. As coffee rituals deepened within homes and coffee houses, something else began to expand alongside them. Movement. Because coffee was no longer just a local tradition, it had become a commodity, valuable, desired, and increasingly in demand. And like all valuable things in the medieval world, it began to travel. From the highlands of Ethiopia to the ports of Yemen, coffee moved along ancient trade routes that had long carried spices, textiles, and precious goods. But unlike many other commodities, coffee carried something intangible with it. A habit, a culture. Merchants played a crucial role in this spread. They transported sacks of beans across deserts, loaded them onto ships, and introduced them to new cities, new markets, new people. Ports like Mocha became central hubs, where coffee was not only traded, but controlled. Because Yemen understood something early on. Coffee was powerful, and they wanted to keep that power. There are accounts suggesting that Yemeni traders took precautions to prevent fertile coffee seeds from leaving the region. Beans were often treated, dried or partially roasted, so they could not be planted elsewhere. The goal was simple: maintain a monopoly, keep the source limited, the demand high. And for a time, it worked. Coffee flowed outward, but its origin remained tightly held. Meanwhile, the demand kept growing. Cities across the Islamic world embraced it. Travellers carried stories of this dark drink that kept the mind sharp and the conversation alive. And wherever it went, Coffee houses followed. Not identical copies, but echoes. Spaces inspired by the same idea of gathering, thinking, and sharing. Trade routes became more than lines of commerce. They became channels of culture. Because when a merchant arrived in a new city with coffee, he wasn't just bringing beans. He was bringing a way of life, an invitation to sit, to drink, to talk. And that invitation was rarely refused. But with growth came tension. As coffee spread, so did interest from outside the Arab world. Foreign traders began to take notice. They saw not just a drink, but an opportunity, and the question slowly began to form. What would happen if coffee escaped its place of origin, if it could be grown elsewhere, traded freely, controlled by others? Because once a commodity becomes global, control becomes fragile. And for Yemen, for the Arab world that had shaped coffee into what it was, that possibility was both inevitable and dangerous. Because the more coffee moved, the harder it became to contain, and the closer it came to changing the world far beyond its original home. As coffee flowed through trade routes and across ports like Mocha, it reached a point where it could no longer be contained. No matter how carefully its origin was guarded, curiosity found a way in. Travellers from distant lands tasted it, merchants carried it home. And slowly, almost quietly, coffee began to cross cultural boundaries. The first major shift came when coffee entered the lands of the Ottoman Empire. Here it was embraced with the same intensity that had defined its rise in the Arab world. Coffee houses appeared in cities like Istanbul, echoing the same atmosphere. Conversation, debate, storytelling, long nights filled with thought. But something else happened here. Coffee began to adapt. It took on new rituals, new flavours, new social meanings. It became more refined in presentation, more structured in etiquette, and as it spread further into Europe through Ottoman trade and diplomacy, it transformed yet again. But the most important shift wasn't cultural, it was agricultural. Because despite Yemen's efforts to protect its monopoly, coffee plants eventually made their way beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Whether through smuggling, experimentation, or sheer persistence, the secret escaped. Coffee could now be grown elsewhere. And that changed everything. Once cultivation began outside its place of origin, coffee was no longer rare, it was scalable. Plantations emerged in new regions, supply increased, prices shifted, and what had once been a tightly controlled commodity began to move more freely across the world. But even as coffee spread and evolved, something remained constant. The core experience. People still gathered, they still sat together, cup in hand, engaged in conversation that stretched beyond necessity into curiosity. Whether in the Middle East, the Ottoman cities, or later in Europe, coffee houses continued to serve the same fundamental purpose. They created space. Space to think. Space to speak. Space to question. And that continuity is what makes coffee's journey so remarkable. Because while the drink itself travelled thousands of miles, changing hands, languages, and traditions, the essence of what it created remained untouched. Connection. And perhaps that is why coffee endured, not just because of its taste, but because of what it made possible. A shared moment, a sharpened mind, a world that felt just a little more awake. And by the time coffee had fully escaped its origins, it was no longer just part of one culture. It belonged to everyone. As coffee spread across cities and cultures, its role began to shift once again. It was no longer just a ritual, no longer just a social habit. It became something quieter and more dangerous. Because wherever people gathered to drink coffee, they also gathered to think. And wherever people think together, something begins to form, opinions, alliances, questions that don't always stay harmless. In the medieval Arab world, coffee houses had already become places where ideas flowed freely. But over time, those ideas grew sharper. Conversations moved beyond poetry and philosophy into territory that made authorities uneasy. Politics, power, control, In cities like Cairo and Damascus, coffee houses became informal centres of influence. Not officially recognised, not structured, but deeply impactful. News spread faster there than in official channels. Opinions formed in real time. And sometimes decisions, quiet, unspoken decisions, began to take shape. Because when people sit together long enough, patterns emerge. Trust builds, and trust can become coordination. This is what made coffee houses subtly revolutionary. Not through loud rebellion, but through quiet accumulation. A shared idea here, a whispered concern there, a realization that others felt the same way. And suddenly, what once seemed like isolated thoughts became something collective. Authorities understood this, even if they couldn't always prove it. They saw the gatherings, they heard the rumours, they felt the shift. Because control depends not just on laws, but on isolation. When people are separated, their thoughts remain contained. But when they come together, regularly, predictably, in spaces where conversation is encouraged, control becomes harder to maintain. And coffee houses did exactly that. They created a network, not formal, not organised, but persistent. And that persistence was enough. There were moments when rulers attempted to limit or monitor these spaces, but the nature of coffee houses made them difficult to suppress. They were too widespread, too integrated into daily life. Closing one simply pushed people to another, because by this point coffee was no longer optional. It was embedded, in routine, in culture, in identity, and with it came the habit of gathering, of speaking, of thinking together. Which is why coffee's influence goes far beyond its taste. It shaped how people interacted, how they processed the world around them, how they questioned it. And while it may not have sparked revolutions in the traditional sense, it created the conditions for something just as powerful: awareness. Because sometimes the most significant changes don't begin with action, they begin with conversation. And in the medieval Arab world, those conversations often began with a simple cup of coffee. Long after the first Sufi mystics sipped coffee in the quiet mountains of Yemen, long after the early coffee houses filled the streets of Cairo and Baghdad with voices and ideas, the legacy of medieval Arab coffee traditions never truly faded. It simply changed form. Because what began as a ritual of wakefulness became a global habit. What started as a spiritual aid turned into a social cornerstone. And what once lived in dimly lit rooms of poetry and philosophy now exists everywhere, from quiet kitchens to crowded city cafes across the world. But beneath all that change, the essence remains. Coffee is still about presence. Think about it. Even today, coffee is rarely just about the drink itself. It is about the pause it creates, the moment of stillness before a conversation begins, the silent agreement between people sitting across from each other, cups in hand, ready to share something, thoughts, ideas, or simply time. That instinct didn't appear randomly. It was shaped, refined, passed down through centuries. In the medieval Arab world, coffee taught people how to gather without urgency. It gave structure to conversations without controlling them. It created spaces where hierarchy softened, where a merchant could speak with a scholar, where a poet could challenge a philosopher. And that influence never disappeared. It spread, evolved, adapted to new cultures, new languages, new settings, but always carrying the same core idea that a simple drink can hold a deeper purpose. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this story, because many things from the past fade, lose relevance, become artifacts. Coffee did the opposite. It integrated itself so completely into daily life that we rarely stop to question it. Yet every time someone sits down with a cup, whether alone or with others, they are participating in something much older than they realize. A tradition shaped in the medieval Arab world. A tradition built on awareness, connection, and shared experience. And in a way, that makes every cup a quiet continuation of history. Not loud, not obvious, but present. Because the real legacy of coffee is not in where it came from. it is in what it continues to create. Moments of thought, moments of conversation, moments where the world slows down just enough for people to truly engage with it, all from a single cup. And that might be the most enduring tradition of all. On a warm, late summer morning in the year 79, the city of Pompeii stirred awake like it always had. Nothing felt unusual. The streets slowly filled with movement. Bakers lit their ovens before sunrise, kneading dough that would soon become loaves for the day. Shopkeepers opened wooden shutters, letting light spill into narrow streets. Slaves hurried through courtyards carrying water, preparing meals, sweeping floors. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere else, a door slammed shut. It was a city alive with routine. And that was precisely the problem. Because routine creates comfort, and comfort makes danger invisible. Just beyond the city, looming quietly in the distance, stood Mount Vesuvius. A massive presence, yes, but not a threatening one. Not anymore. Its slopes were covered in greenery. Vineyards stretched across its sides. Farmers worked its land without hesitation. To the people of Pompeii, it was simply part of the landscape. Not a warning, not a threat, just there. But beneath that calm surface, something had been building for years. 17 years earlier, a violent earthquake had shaken the region, damaging buildings and leaving cracks in walls that still hadn't been fully repaired. At the time, it had been terrifying, but time does what it always does. It dulls fear. People rebuild, they adapt, they convince themselves that the worst has already passed, and so life continued. Even in the days leading up to that morning, there had been small signs, subtle tremors beneath the ground, animals behaving strangely, wells drying up without explanation. But none of it was enough to break the rhythm of daily life, because no one truly understood what they were dealing with. They didn't know that the mountain was not asleep, it was waiting. And on that morning, as bread baked in ovens and conversations drifted through open streets, something deep within the earth began to shift. Not loudly, not yet, but steadily. Pressure building, energy rising, a force gathering beneath layers of rock that had held it in place for centuries. The people of Pompeii went about their day, unaware that they were living the final hours of a world that would soon be erased, frozen, buried, preserved in a single violent moment, because by the time anyone realized what was happening, it would already be too late. It began just after midday. At first, it was not an explosion in the way we imagine it today. No immediate firestorm, no roaring inferno sweeping across the land. Instead, there was a sound, deep, unnatural, like the earth itself tearing apart from within. Then the sky changed. Above Mount Vesuvius, a towering column of ash and gas erupted upward with terrifying force. It rose higher and higher, forming a massive cloud that spread outward at the top, like a dark umbrella swallowing the blue sky. Those who saw it must have frozen, not understanding. Not yet. In Pompeii, people began to gather in the streets, looking toward the mountain. Some pointed, some shouted, others simply stared, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing, because nothing like this had ever been seen before. The cloud grew thicker, darker, heavier, and then, slowly at first, things began to fall. Ash, fine, grey particles drifting down from the sky like an unnatural snowfall. At first it seemed almost harmless, light enough to brush off. Strange, yes, but not immediately deadly. People covered their heads, some laughed nervously, others began to worry, because the ash did not stop. It kept falling, and falling, and soon it was no longer just ash. Small stones, pumice, began to rain down, clattering against rooftops, striking the ground with increasing force. The air filled with dust. Breathing became harder. Visibility began to fade. Daylight dimmed. Not gradually, like sunset, but abruptly, as if the sun itself had been taken away. Panic started to spread. Families rushed back into their homes, gathering belongings, calling out for one another. Some tried to flee the city, wrapping cloth around their faces, pushing through streets that were quickly becoming unrecognizable under layers of ash. Others hesitated, waiting, hoping it would pass, because it still didn't look like total destruction. Not yet. But the mountain was far from finished. The eruption continued to intensify. The column of ash climbed higher, fed by forces deep beneath the earth. The ground trembled. The sky darkened further, turning day into something closer to night. And with every passing moment, the weight of what was happening began to settle in. This was not a passing storm. This was something else, something unstoppable. Because what had begun as falling ash was only the first stage, and the worst had not even reached them yet. As the ash continued to fall over Pompeii, what had first seemed strange quickly became unbearable. The ground disappeared beneath a thick, growing layer of grey. Streets turned uneven, slippery, difficult to navigate. Every step became heavier, every breath more strained. The air itself felt wrong, dry, choking, filled with fine particles that clung to the throat and lungs. And still, it did not stop. The pumice stones falling from the sky grew larger, sharper, heavier. They struck rooftops with dull, relentless force. At first, buildings held, but Pompeii was not built for this. Roofs, designed to keep out rain and sun, began to buckle under the increasing weight, and then, one by one, they started to collapse. A sudden crack, a sharp, splintering sound, and then the crushing impact of stone and timber giving way. Inside homes, people scrambled. Some tried to hold doors shut against the falling debris. Others gathered in corners, shielding themselves with whatever they could find. Some fled into the streets, believing open space meant safety. But the streets were no better, because outside, the sky had darkened even further. It was no longer day. It was something else entirely. A dim, suffocating twilight filled with drifting ash and constant noise. The steady fall of debris, the distant rumble of the mountain, the growing panic of thousands of people trying to understand what to do. Some attempted to leave the city. They wrapped cloth around their faces, held hands with loved ones, and pushed forward through the chaos. But movement was slow. The ash piled higher with every step. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Landmarks vanished beneath grey layers. The familiar became unfamiliar, and in that confusion, direction itself began to disappear. Others chose to stay, to hide, to wait it out, because the idea that an entire city could be destroyed in a single day was almost impossible to grasp. Surely this would pass. Surely the mountain would calm. But the mountain was only growing stronger. Beneath the surface, pressure continued to build. The eruption column towered above, feeding the relentless rain of ash and stone. And far above the city, unseen by those struggling below, something dangerous was beginning to form. The column was becoming unstable, and when it would finally collapse, everything would change, because what had been falling from above was slow. What was coming next would not be. And for the people of Pompeii, already exhausted, already disoriented, already trapped in a world turning dark, there would be no time left to react. By the time the ash had buried streets and crushed roofs across Pompeii, many believed they had already faced the worst. They were wrong. High above, the towering column of ash rising from Mount Vesuvius had reached a breaking point. It could no longer hold itself together. The immense weight of ash, gas, and debris began to collapse inward. And when it did, it didn't fall gently. It fell fast. A dense, superheated surge of gas, ash, and rock rushed down the slopes of the volcano with unstoppable force. This was not something you could outrun, not something you could hide from. It moved like a living wall, silent at first, then roaring as it gained speed, devouring everything in its path. This was the pyroclastic surge. and it changed everything. Unlike the falling ash, which had given people time to react, this came without warning. A sudden shift, a violent release. Within moments, the landscape itself became lethal. The first waves struck nearby areas with devastating intensity, but Pompeii would not be spared for long. As the surge approached, the air grew hotter. Breathing became harder. Then, impossible. Because this was not just heat, it was suffocation. A mixture of toxic gases and fine ash filled the air, replacing oxygen with something deadly. People collapsed where they stood, unable to take another breath. Others tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The surge moved too quickly. When it reached the city, it poured through streets, over walls, into homes. It did not knock on doors. It did not slow down. It entered everything, filled everything, erased everything. And in that moment, life stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. People were caught mid-action. A man shielding his face. A woman clutching a child. A group huddled together in a final attempt at safety. All frozen in place. Not by time, but by the sudden, overwhelming force of heat and ash. It was over in minutes. The noise, the panic, the movement, all replaced by silence. But even after the surge passed, the mountain was not finished. More waves followed. Layer upon layer of ash and debris settled over the city, sealing it beneath a thick blanket that would remain undisturbed for centuries. What had once been a living, breathing Roman city was now something else. Not destroyed in the way we imagine destruction, but preserved. Every street, every home, every final moment, every locked in place beneath the weight of a single catastrophic day. And as the ash settled and the sky slowly cleared, there was nothing left to save. After the final surges swept through Pompeii, the world did not end with noise. It ended with silence. The sky, once choked with ash, slowly began to clear. The violent roar of Mount Vesuvius faded into the distance. The ground, which had trembled and shifted for hours, grew still again. But what remained beneath that stillness was not peace. It was absence. Where there had once been streets filled with voices, there was now only a thick, unmoving layer of ash and debris. Homes stood half-buried or collapsed entirely. Doorways were sealed. Courtyards vanished. The city itself had been erased from sight, as if it had never existed. And yet, it was all still there, beneath the surface, preserved. The ash that had destroyed Pompeii also protected it. It covered everything quickly, sealing objects, buildings, and even people in place. Oxygen was cut off. Decay slowed. Movement stopped completely. Time itself seemed to pause. Inside homes, tables remained set. Pots still rested over cold hearths. Bread sat inside ovens, never to be removed. In workshops, tools lay where they had been dropped. In shops, goods remained arranged as they had been just hours before. A city caught mid-breath, and then held there. But the most haunting remnants were the people. Not bodies in the usual sense, but impressions. Voids left behind as ash hardened around them. Positions frozen in their final moments. Some curled inward, shielding themselves. Others stretched outward, as if reaching for escape. Groups huddled together, their last instinct not to run alone, but to stay together. Because in the end, even in chaos, people choose connection. Above all this, the land slowly changed. Rain fell. Layers settled. Vegetation began to grow again over the buried city. With each passing year, the memory of Pompeii faded from the living world. New generations walked above it, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. A city turned into a story. And then, eventually, not even that. Because without visible ruins, without survivors to tell the tale in detail, Pompeii became something distant. A place mentioned, perhaps, in passing. A disaster remembered in fragments, but not fully understood, not truly seen. because the truth of what had happened that day was not gone. It was waiting beneath layers of ash, perfectly preserved, untouched by time, waiting for someone centuries later to uncover it. And when they finally did, the silence would begin to speak again. For centuries, Pompeii remained hidden beneath layers of earth and memory. The disaster that had erased it also protected it so completely that the city simply vanished. Fields grew above it. Roads passed nearby. Villages rose and fell in the surrounding region. Life continued, unaware that beneath the soil lay an entire world, frozen in a single day. It wasn't until the 18th century that something changed. Workers digging in the area began to uncover fragments, walls, frescoes, objects that didn't belong to their time. At first, these discoveries seemed random, pieces of a forgotten past, disconnected and incomplete. But slowly, a realization began to form. This wasn't just a ruin, it was a city. As excavations expanded, rooms emerged, then streets, then entire buildings. And what astonished those who uncovered them was not just their existence, but their condition. They were intact, not rebuilt, not altered, preserved exactly as they had been left. Paintings still clung to walls, vibrant and detailed. Mosaics lay undisturbed on floors. Everyday objects, jars, tools, furniture, sat where they had been abandoned, as if their owners had simply stepped out and never returned. Because in a sense, they hadn't. But the most powerful discoveries came when archaeologists began to understand the shapes left behind in the ash. At first, they were simply hollow spaces, voids in hardened layers. But when these spaces were filled with plaster, something extraordinary appeared. Forms, human forms, people captured in their final moments. A figure curled on the ground, a pair embracing, a man covering his face. Even animals, dogs still bound by chains, caught mid-struggle. These were not sculptures, not interpretations. They were impressions of real lives, stopped instantly and preserved for nearly 2,000 years. And suddenly the past was no longer distant. It was immediate. Because this was not just architecture or artifacts. This was a moment. A moment that could now be seen, walked through, felt. For the first time, the full reality of what had happened in 79 became visible. Not as a story told in fragments, but as a space that still existed, quiet, intact, waiting. And with that discovery, Pompeii transformed once again. From a lost city to a window into the ancient world. A place where time had not just passed, but paused. As more of Pompeii emerged from beneath the ash, something unexpected became clear. This was not just a tragedy, it was a time capsule. Because unlike other ancient cities, which had been slowly worn down, rebuilt or erased over centuries, Pompeii had been frozen in a single moment. There was no gradual change, no layering of history. Everything belonged to one day, and that made it incredibly rare. Walking through its streets, you are not seeing a reconstruction. You are seeing a Roman city exactly as it was lived in. The layout, the objects, the details of daily life preserved with astonishing clarity. The streets still show grooves carved by cartwheels, evidence of constant movement. Stepping stones remain in place, allowing pedestrians to cross without stepping into waste that once flowed through the roads. Shops line the streets, their counters still intact, with large clay jars embedded into them, used to store food and drink for customers. This was not a silent, distant past. This was a working city. Inside homes, the level of detail becomes even more striking. Walls are covered in colourful frescoes, scenes of mythology, landscapes, and everyday moments. Floors display intricate mosaics, carefully arranged piece by piece. Furniture, though often decayed, leaves behind its imprint, revealing how rooms were arranged, how space was used. And then, there are the more intimate spaces. Bakeries, where millstones still stand, and ovens still hold carbonized bread, caught mid-bake, taverns where people once gathered to eat and drink, and yes, even brothels, where walls are marked with paintings and inscriptions that hint at the private lives of those who lived there. Because Pompeii does not hide anything, it shows everything, the ordinary, the personal, the human. Even graffiti remains, messages scratched into walls, jokes, names, declarations of love, complaints, voices from the past, still visible, still readable, still oddly familiar. And that might be the most powerful part of all, because when you look at Pompeii, you don't just see ancient Romans as distant figures in history. You see people who worked, laughed, argued, loved and lived lives not so different from our own. And in that realization, something shifts. The eruption is no longer just a natural disaster. It becomes personal. Because this was not just a city that was lost. It was a city that was alive, right up until the very last moment. As archaeologists continued to study Pompeii, they began to do something extraordinary. They started to reconstruct the final hours. Not through guesswork alone, but through evidence. Layers of ash, positions of bodies, objects left behind. Every detail told part of the story. And when those details were brought together, a clearer picture began to emerge. The eruption was not a single moment. It was a sequence. First, the ash fall, hours of it. Enough time for people to react, to choose, to stay or to flee. Some gathered belongings, others sought shelter indoors. A few managed to escape early, moving away from the city before conditions worsened. But many remained, perhaps out of confusion, perhaps out of hope that it would stop. Then came the darkness, the sky blocked by ash, day turning into night, panic spreading, movement becoming difficult, people navigating streets they could barely see, breathing air that grew heavier with each passing hour. And then, the final stage, the pyroclastic surges, fast, unstoppable, deadly. The positions in which people were found tell this part of the story more clearly than any written account. Some are seen lying down, as if overcome by exhaustion or suffocation. Others are crouched, arms raised to shield their faces. Groups cluster together, families perhaps, caught in a final moment of shared fear. There is no sign of prolonged struggle, no signs of extended escape attempts during that final phase. Because there was no time. The heat, the gas, the ash. It overwhelmed everything within moments. In nearby Herculaneum, the evidence tells a slightly different but equally tragic story. There, many had gathered near the shoreline, hoping to escape by sea. But the surges reached them too, trapping them where they stood, waiting, hoping, until there was no more time left to hope. And when the surges passed, they left behind not chaos, but stillness. A city of positions, a record of decisions made under pressure, stay or go, hide or run, wait or act, each choice frozen in place. And that is what makes Pompeii so powerful. It is not just a story of destruction. It is a story of human reaction, of uncertainty, of instinct. Because in the end, the eruption did not just destroy buildings. It captured moments. Moments that allow us, centuries later, to see not just what happened, but how people faced it. Even now, nearly 2,000 years after that day, Mount Vesuvius still stands over the Bay of Naples. Quiet, unmoving, almost peaceful. But that silence is not comfort. It is a reminder. Because Vesuvius is not extinct. It is active. It has erupted many times since 79, though none as devastatingly preserved in memory as the one that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. And today, millions of people live within its reach, building homes, raising families, going about their lives beneath the shadow of the same mountain, just like they did before. Which is what makes this story feel so close, because Pompeii is not just about the past, it is about patterns, human patterns. We settle near fertile land. We grow comfortable with quiet mountains. We learn to ignore distant risks, especially when they remain silent for generations. And slowly, without realizing it, we begin to believe that what has not happened in our lifetime will not happen again. But history suggests otherwise. The eruption of 79 was not unique in the existence of the volcano. It was simply the one we remember best. And perhaps that is why Pompeii still matters, not because of the destruction alone, but because of what it preserved. A full picture of life, interrupted without warning. A reminder that even the most ordinary day can carry the potential for sudden change. That routine, while comforting, can also blind us. And that nature, no matter how calm it appears, holds forces far beyond human control. Walking through Pompeii today, you see more than ruins. You see streets that once carried footsteps, homes that once held conversations, spaces that once felt safe. And above it all, in the distance, you see Vesuvius, still there, still watching. Not as a villain, not as something with intent, but as a force, unpredictable, indifferent, and patient. Because the mountain does not remember what it has done, but we do. And maybe that is the real legacy of Pompeii. Not just a city frozen in time, but a warning. Quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore once you truly understand it. That everything we build, everything we trust as permanent, exists always on borrowed time.